I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Forgotten Oscar Films. And this week we're going to be looking at the 1991 Oscars and looking at a self-indulgent but pretty impressive directorial and starring role from Barbara Streisand. The movie is The Prince of Tides. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is pick a movie that's nominated for Best Picture that I believe to be forgotten to time. A movie that just isn't as talked about as much, not shown on TV, hard to find on streaming, and just not as beloved as some of the other nominees, and try to answer why this movie was forgotten versus some of the others. And the show works in three parts. The first, just giving some historical context, to explain essentially why I picked one movie over the other nominees. Then I give my thoughts on the movie, because for most of these movies I'm seeing them for the very first time. And then finally, that third and final part, trying to answer why this movie was forgotten versus the others. But the 1991 Oscars actually was pretty historical. I mean, we got a Big Five, a Best Picture winner nominee. We get an animated feature getting nominated for the very first time. We have an epic conspiracy thriller. And we have these sort of two self-indulgent movies with movie stars that retired and became less relevant in the 21st century. So looking back on those five nominees, the first one being The Silence of the Lambs, that was the Big Five winner, because only three movies in the history of the Oscars have ever won Best Picture, Best Director, Best Screenplay, and Best Lead Actor and Best Lead Actress. The other movies being One Flew Over a Cuckoo's Nest and It Happened One Night. So this movie is in legendary status. This is very rare for movies to sort of have this above the line sweep in this regard. So while it's not a movie that has the most Oscar wins, it has maybe the most important Oscar wins. It's a movie that is shown on TV all the time. It's spawned a TV show and multiple movies. Hannibal Lecter is an iconic film presence at this point, an iconic Anthony Hopkins performance with iconic lines. It's from a director, Jonathan Demme, who after he passed, had a bunch of outpouring of support from amazing young directors like Barry Jenkins, who was influenced by him. So this was a huge movie that's respected by sort of the general public, but also the artistic crowd too. It's a highly rated on IMDb. It's not forgotten. It's a well-beloved movie. So Silence of the Lambs was not a movie I even considered to cover. Then we have Beauty and the Beast, which I also think is another modern-day classic. In many ways, it's of the ilk of Snow White and Cinderella, even though it was released 50 years later. And this was the first animated movie to ever get nominated for Best Picture. And that's a feat only two other movies have done, in Up and Toy Story 3. So it's still a very rare thing to happen. But it was a symbolization of the Disney Renaissance. 89, we get Little Mermaid, then we have Beauty and the Beast, then Aladdin, The Lion King, and the sort of revival of the Disney musical. People still dress up as Belle as Halloween. This is an iconic movie. The remake made $1 billion just 4 years ago, so this is an iconic movie and a well-beloved movie, and a movie that's not forgotten. Then we have JFK, and this is a strange movie, an odd movie, but a movie I really like. And it's a movie that I think really hit a certain demographic at the time when it was released, and then that demographic went on to write about it and do podcasts about it, which is where I discovered it from those people, and went back and really loved it too. I mean, it's a weird movie. It's strange, but it's super long, but super interesting. It's super engaging during that entire time. It fits kind of the conspiracy culture that the internet sort of only, I think, accentuated, but with the original conspiracy. I mean, the name is JFK of the movie, so just the fact that it's named JFK, I think it's still going to be relevant, and people are still going to watch it and know about it. And it's from Oliver Stone, who's got a fascinating career arc. I think it's just a really great movie. I think it's a masterpiece, and I think it's a movie that's still referenced and talked about because of how sort of controversial and how strange it is. I think it's a movie that I saw many times before doing this episode. I love the movie, so as much as I want to talk about the movie, I still think that it's more remembered than some of the other nominees. Then we have Bugsy, which is, directed by Barry Levinson, but is really a Warren Beatty project. I mean, starring his wife, Annette Bening. Every sort of Warren Beatty starring role or directing role, didn't matter, happened every sort of 2-3 years, in which it was sort of a big deal. He was in it, so everything was about Warren Beatty. But because we covered actually Warren Beatty and a bit of his career arc in the 1981 episode of Reds for the first season of Forgotten Oscar Films, I decided, let's go with a different kind of complicated movie star, do-it-herself kind of a director in Barbara Streisand. And similarly to someone like Warren Beatty, both of them have done very little in the 21st century in terms of directing. You know, Warren Beatty made only a couple more movies that he directed after this movie was released. Barbara Streisand only made one more movie that she directed after this. So, and then kind of they both of them retired in the 21st century. And because of that, even though they were sort of huge movie stars at the time that made a lot of money and they were sort of the peak of the movie star moment, still because of that, someone like myself who grew up in the 21st century just knew less about them. I mean, I knew Barbara Streisand from the Duck Sauce song more than anything. And because they sort of fell into sort of retirement and out of the public eye, they've become a little bit more forgotten, or the movies have become more forgotten, but we'll talk about that later. At the time, Barbara Streisand was a huge deal. Even then, I mean, I would argue that 91 was actually the peak of Barbara Streisand, even though she premiered in the 60s with Funny Girl, and she broke out to the scene with that great William Wyler movie, and does, you know, Star is Born and all these great other movies. I think this is really sort of the culmination of her as a movie star, because she really brought this project to a head. She's the producer, she's the director, she stars in the movie. And this was a big deal. Similar to someone like Leonardo DiCaprio today, there's only a Barbara Streisand movie once every 5 years where she shows up and reminds you of how likable she is. And people are waiting for her. I mean, she's this uniquely sort of amazing triple threat talent. She can direct, she can produce, she can write, she can act, she can sing, she can dance. She can really do all of it. And she's a fascinating, incredibly super uber talented person. And I think that has an undeniable charm to her. So there was a real celebration every time there was a 5 years, you know, something would happen. Her directorial debut, 1983, gets a bunch of the Oscars. Then she does Nuts in 87, which she doesn't direct. And then she comes back with this in 91, where she stars and directs. And it's a huge deal. And it makes not #1 box office, but a lot of money at the box office, top 20. Sort of shows Nick Nolte with this and Cape Fear as like a serious leading man. And I think as much as people wanted to hate her or Warren Beatty for sort of the behind the scenes demanding and sort of diva element or movie star kind of demands, that they were ready to, you know, hate her for The Mirror Has Two Faces, this one was just too good of a movie, I think, for people to really hate her. And she was at the top of the world, getting Best Picture, you know, getting a DGA nomination, getting a bunch of other nominations for the film, and it really was a huge success. As a matter of fact, she actually lost out on a directing nomination, I think, because John Singleton got nominated, which had this sort of great historical moment that I don't think will ever be beaten, in the sense that he was 24 when he was nominated, which is still the youngest a director has ever been to get nominated for Best Director. He was also the first black director to ever get nominated. He's unfortunately passed, but, you know, had an interesting career as well. And personally, I probably would have gone with Boys in the Hood for Best Picture instead of this movie, for example. But transitioning now into my thoughts and judging the movie on its own merit, while I probably like Boys in the Hood a little bit better, this movie surprised me in how much I enjoyed it. I really thought it would be sort of this cheesy, melodramatic, romantic movie that was super self-indulgent. And while it is all those things in one sense, I think it's a real sort of achievement from Barbara Streisand in her ability to just make a movie that is completely aware of what it is and commits to what it is. So many movies nowadays are very afraid to get sentimental or emotional, that oftentimes they're seen as sort of lower class or cheesy, or if you have to do something that's emotional, you have to undercut it with sort of a wink joke that sort of is meta and recognizes what it's doing. It's not, movies aren't allowed to be just sort of genuinely sentimental. Very, very rarely are they allowed to do that without that sort of undercutting. But when they do, you know, they really resonate. And I think Prince of Tides is one of those movies that maybe goes so far in the other direction, but it is still a melodrama in its own right, and it respects that, it understands that, and it wants to be that, and I think it was successful at that. At the beginning, I was a little bit nervous. I was like, this is a little bit over the top, this is pretty dramatic, but it's a real testament to Barbara Streisand as a director, and I think that's the sort of big takeaway from me, was how consistent the movie is, how the tone, you know, there's no sort of winking, there's no nod, sort of, you know, self-awareness to the movie. This movie knows that this is a melodrama about trauma, about relationships, about masculinity, about your past, and sort of confronting that. It's a very baby boomer movie in that sense, which I think is in part why it's maybe a little bit forgotten. But, you know, this is a movie with a Criterion Collection edition. It's a movie that's still well regarded, still well appreciated, and I think because it's it commits so hard to melodrama that by the middle of the movie, you don't care about the over-the-top acting and the real dramatic sort of sense of there's a music swell every 2 seconds. You don't care about that because you're actually invested in the story, because you actually are so emotionally engaged with the characters, because because the movie is so confident in the sense that it knows what it wants to be and it's being that. And because it's so confident in that, you go, okay, yeah, sure, and you get swept up with it, swept up with it, and you get so engaged with the movie and engaged with the storylines of the characters. It really is sort of a success in that regard. And then, of course, to Barbara Streisand, even maybe seen as a sort of diva, ego, kind of a movie star figure, I still think that, her decision to make Nick Nolte really the movie star of this movie was a great one in that, as much as Nick Nolte, I love Nick Nolte in Warrior and Thin Red Line and Affliction, I think this may be his best performance, which is saying a lot. I mean, no other time has he been such a great movie star. This movie, what he does with his body and how he's so antsy, I mean, it's a really magnificent full body performance. How it's this sort of great thing where he's talking about his sister, but he's also recollecting his own past because they're twins. They have a very similar experience, and then the sort of trauma that affected him and his relationship with his parents and how that made him a man today, and maybe why is that a reason to why his sister tried to kill herself. But he really puts the film on his shoulders in the sense that he can do the monologues, he can do the dramatic, he can be that romantic kind of big, strong, masculine man, but he also be very vulnerable and small at other times. It's a really terrific Nick Nolte performance. And Barbara Streisand's great in it. She's charming and she's funny, as she always is. But Nick Nolte was a real standout for me. That Streisand as a director was really apparent here. But also sort of how she allowed Nolte to really be himself. And when he's on top of his game, there's few other actors like him and Nick Cage and really no one else that uses, maybe Brando, that uses their body to such an extent that's so just completely envelops the screen, where you can do a wide and they feel so big. Now, I do have some problems with the movie. I think it's about 20 minutes too long. It is very sort of, the music cues are a little bit over the top at times. They try to fit a lot of stuff from the book into the movie, which doesn't necessarily need to be there. Some of the relationships feel a little bit cheap, but that doesn't really matter because the heart of the movie has such this great Nick Nolte performance. It really is a moving with that relationship between Lowenstein and Nick Nolte's character. So much so that you don't care about some of the other parts because ultimately it's a successful movie because of how much it commits to that kind of a melodrama. But trying to figure out now why this movie is forgotten, I think in one part, I consider this movie a very baby boomer movie in the sense that with The Big Chill in 1983, and you could even say Grand Canyon this year, or The Accidental Tourist, the sort of Lawrence Kasdan type of movies, and this movie, this idea that, the baby boomers are at this period of time when they're 40s and they're looking back at their past and how their past shaped them, and we're getting sort of Freudian analytics onto it in this sort of, where it's very much focused on upper class problems without actually recognizing the difference between the sort of upper and middle classes, or the separation at that point. It's concerned about your past and how you're comfortable, but you don't feel good inside. And that connected with a lot of baby boomers at the time, but I don't think that's a sentiment that is felt by millennials or Gen Z today, which is why I think in part why the movie just doesn't resonate. I appreciated it, but I appreciate it from a sort of a melodramatic, from a filmmaking, from a relationship kind of perspective. But I also recognize that some of the themes and the choice of subject matter that the film approaches probably wouldn't be approached today, and because of that, some people have a hard time sort of relating to the story. So actually, I think in one part, the contents of the movie are in part, or the themes that they're trying to explore, are in part a reason why this movie isn't as successful as maybe it should be today. And then the other thing I think is important is just that she retired. I mean, she does 3 movies in the 21st century, one in 2004, one in 2010 and one in 2012, and that's it. And she sort of, shops in her underground mall and maybe does a carpool karaoke every once in a while, but that may be telling too. I mean, in the sense that her carpool karaoke, the James Corden bet, her YouTube video only has like 8 million views. But if you look at someone like Selena Gomez, it's 100 million, or, you know what I mean? Like, it's crazy to see like the difference between where she just hasn't really adapted herself to the new generation. The younger generation just doesn't know her. And the truth is, the unfortunate reality of movie stars is that if you're not relevant, if you're not in movies, you're not acting, you become less relevant, you become more forgotten. I mean, Annette Bening. I know Annette Bening because she's in 20th Century Woman, because she's in Captain Marvel, because she's in Film Stars Don't Die in Liverpool, because she's still working. But her husband, Warren Beatty, or even someone like Barbara Streisand, they're just not working anymore. And they'll be recognized as these sort of legendary classic icons, and you can retire at any time you want. I'm not sort of going against that, but in terms of trying to understand why it's forgotten, well, because Barbara Streisand isn't as much of a cultural figure as she was back then, and because she directed this movie and starred and produced it, I mean, it's very much her movie, because of those things, we just don't see this movie as talked about as much, or received or reviewed as often as maybe it should be. You know, just the fact that it has a Criterion Collection shows the fact that, you know, Goodfellas is non-Criterion because it's a well-liked, well-appreciated movie. In one part, the Criterion Collection is highlighting movies that have been a little bit forgotten, or sort of great movies, but are just, you know, a little bit more under the radar, a little not, you know, Godfather, for example. And I think The Prince of Tides kind of fits into that mold. It's a different kind. I wish the Criterion Collection kind of did more of these kinds of movies, because it's not the traditional cynical, grim, you know, serious societal kind of approach to things. It's very much more romantic in that sense, and movie star focused and driven and relationship focused, and fish out of water kind of an aspect. But it's really fantastic in that sense. And like I said, the movie I was really impressed with. But despite that, I think just because Barbara Streisand isn't as prevalent today and relevant today, I think that hurts the success of her movies. And Nick Nolte is another guy who shows up every once in a while. Like, he's great in Warrior, but he doesn't show up that often. So because of that, the two leads not being as relevant, and the director not being as relevant today, or just not making any movies, I think hurts ultimately the forgotten element of this movie. But that's been it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know your thoughts on Prince of Tides. Have you seen it? Have you not? Let me know. I'd love to hear it. But that's about it, guys. Until next time, stay tuned.